Well, our youngest man is 21 years of age.
That's what the warden said in 1957, but that was far from the truth. From 17-year-old James H. Austin, locked in solitary for murder, to 18-year-old Clarence Carnes, the Choctaw Kid, who got caught up in a deadly prison riot, these are some of the youngest lives crushed and, in rare cases, reshaped by the rock. Clarence Victor Carnes, the Choctaw Kid. Our story begins with the youngest inmate ever sent to Alcatraz, Clarence Victor Carnes, better known as the Choctaw Kid. Born on January 14, 1927, in Daisy, Oklahoma, Carnes was a member of the Choctaw Native American tribe and the oldest of 5 children raised in poverty. Carnes's path to criminality began early. As a child, he stole candy bars, a seemingly minor offense that would be the first step in a rapidly escalating criminal career. By age 16, an age when most teenagers are attending high school and contemplating their future, Carnes was sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder of a garage attendant during an attempted robbery in 1943. His journey to Alcatraz began after he escaped from Granite Reformatory in early 1945. Following his recapture, federal authorities deemed the young man too dangerous and escape-prone for standard facilities. On July 6, 1945, at the age of just 18, Clarence Carnes became the youngest inmate ever to walk through the imposing gates of Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary. Imagine, if you will, an 18-year-old, barely legally an adult, entering the forbidding world of Alcatraz, where the average inmate was significantly older and hardened by years of criminal activity. The psychological impact of such an experience on a young mind is difficult to comprehend. Carnes's notoriety, however, was just beginning. Less than a year after his arrival, he became involved in one of the most violent episodes in the prison's history, the infamous Battle of Alcatraz, on May 2, 1946. This bloody escape attempt, which Carnes participated in at the tender age of 19, involved 6 inmates who managed to overpower guards, obtain weapons, and attempt to shoot their way out of the prison. The ensuing 48-hour siege resulted in the deaths of 2 guards, William Miller and Harold Stites, and 3 inmates, Bernard Coy, Joseph Kretzer, and Marvin Hubbard. When the smoke cleared, Carnes was the only participant in the escape attempt to survive, spared the death penalty that was handed down to his co-conspirators Miran Edgar Thompson and Sam Shockley. Why was Carnes spared? Reports suggest it was because he refused to kill guards as ordered by the other inmates during the uprising. Instead of execution, Carnes received an additional 99-year sentence for kidnapping while on the run, essentially guaranteeing he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. Following the Battle of Alcatraz, Carnes was placed in D Block, the segregation unit reserved for the most problematic inmates. There he remained until the prison's closure in 1963, spending approximately 18 years in one of the most restrictive environments in the American penal system. After Alcatraz closed its doors, Carnes was transferred to other federal prisons. In 1973, at the age of 46, he was finally granted parole, a taste of freedom that proved short-lived. He violated the terms of his parole not once, but twice, resulting in his return to federal custody. Carnes's life came to an end on October 3, 1988, at the Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri. He was 61 years old and died from complications related to AIDS, having spent the majority of his life, 43 years, behind bars. Initially buried in an unmarked grave, his body was later exhumed and reburied in Billy Cemetery, Daisy, Oklahoma, in 1989, with expenses funded by former Alcatraz inmate James Whitey Bulger, who provided a $4,000 bronze casket. The story of Clarence Victor Carnes stands as a stark reminder of how early criminal behavior can lead to a lifetime of incarceration. From stealing candy as a child to becoming the youngest inmate at America's most notorious prison, his life trajectory illustrates the devastating consequences of crime and the harsh realities of the American justice system in the mid-20th century. While Clarence Carnes is often cited as the youngest Alcatraz inmate, research from the National Archives reveals another young man who preceded him, James H. Austin, who was incarcerated at Alcatraz in 1939 at the astonishingly young age of 17. James H. Austin, a forgotten youth. According to records from the National Archives, Austin was listed as register number 583, making him not only one of the earliest inmates during the federal penitentiary era, but potentially the youngest person ever to be incarcerated on the Rock. The details of Austin's life and crimes remain shrouded in historical obscurity. Unlike many Alcatraz inmates who gained notoriety through sensational crimes or escape attempts, Austin appears to have left a much fainter mark on the historical record. This absence of information itself tells us something significant about the nature nature of historical documentation and how certain stories become amplified while others fade into the background. What led a 17-year-old to be imprisoned in America's most secure federal facility during the late 1930s? The specific crimes that brought Austin to Alcatraz aren't clearly documented in publicly available sources, but we know that during this era, Alcatraz was reserved for inmates who were considered particularly troublesome, prone to escape attempts, or had significant influence over other prisoners. For a teenager to be deemed dangerous enough to warrant placement in Alcatraz suggests either extremely severe criminal activity or a pattern of disruptive behavior in other facilities that prompted authorities to take the unusual step of sending such a young person to the country's most restrictive prison. Life for a 17-year-old at Alcatraz would have been extraordinarily challenging. The prison operated on a strict routine with minimal privileges. Inmates spent approximately 14 hours per day in their cells, as mentioned by Warden Madigan in his 1957 interview.
You are now in the big cell block, double-bolted, time-locked bars, and pink walls. Alcatraz has one guard for every 3 inmates. The prisoners spend some 14 hours a day in cells 5 feet wide, 9 feet deep.
For a teenager, adjusting to such isolation and restriction would have been particularly difficult. The psychological impact of being surrounded by much older, hardened criminals while still in the formative years of development must have been profound. The absence of detailed information about Austin's time at Alcatraz leaves us with many unanswered questions. How long did he remain there? Did he ever adapt to the harsh environment? Was he eventually transferred to another facility? Did he ever gain his freedom? And if so, what became of him afterward? What we do know is that Austin's presence at Alcatraz at such a young age challenges our understanding of how juvenile offenders were treated in the mid-20th century American justice system. While today's legal standards generally separate juvenile and adult offenders, Austin's case reminds us that the boundaries were much more fluid in the past, with devastating consequences for young people caught in the criminal justice system. Austin's largely forgotten story serves as a poignant reminder of how historical narratives often focus on the most sensational or well-documented cases, while equally important stories can slip through the cracks of historical memory. It also raises important questions about juvenile justice and the wisdom of placing very young offenders in adult facilities, questions that continue to resonate in contemporary discussions about criminal justice reform. As we continue to explore the youngest inmates at Alcatraz, James H. Austin stands as a shadowy figure whose mere presence challenges our understanding of this infamous prison's history and legacy. As the sparse historical record of 17-year-old James H. Austin demonstrates how some stories slip through the cracks of history, we turn now to a young man whose place in Alcatraz history is unmistakable. Frank Lucas Bolt, inmate number 1. The story of Frank Lucas Bolt represents one of the most unique cases among Alcatraz's youngest prisoners. Born on January 11, 1908 in Pulaski, Virginia, Bolt holds the distinction of being the very first inmate at Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, literally designated as inmate number 1, when he arrived on June 19, 1934, at the age of 26. While marginally older than some others on our list, Bolt's status as the first prisoner and the circumstances of his incarceration make his story particularly compelling. He arrived at Alcatraz 2 months before the prison officially opened on August 11, 1934, effectively serving as the inaugural resident of what would become America's most infamous correctional facility. Bolt's path to Alcatraz began while serving in the United States Army. By 1930, he was stationed at Fort Sherman in the Panama Canal Zone as a member of Battery E, Light Coast Artillery. His military career came to an abrupt end in the fall of 1932 when, at age 24, he was arrested by military police for a homosexual act, classified as sodomy in his criminal record. This arrest occurred during a time when homosexuality was not only stigmatized, but criminalized, particularly in military contexts. Bolt was reportedly incarcerated with over 50 other soldiers for similar offenses, highlighting a broader pattern of persecution. On January 24, 1933, he received a 5-year sentence to be served at a military prison in Honolulu, Hawaii. The decision to transfer Bolt to the newly established Alcatraz in 1934 is particularly interesting because it diverged from the facility's stated purpose. Alcatraz was designed to house prisoners who were deemed dangerous, prone to escape, or particularly troublesome in other facilities. Bolt, as a military prisoner convicted of a consensual act between adults, didn't fit the typical profile of an Alcatraz inmate. Perhaps most tellingly, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover personally signed Bolt's admission papers, suggesting that Alcatraz was not only a place for containing dangerous criminals, but also a symbol of the government's stance toward untoward behaviors deemed socially unacceptable at the time. This aspect of Alcatraz's history, as a tool for moral enforcement rather than just criminal containment, adds a complex dimension to our understanding of the institution. Bolt's time at Alcatraz was relatively uneventful compared to many other inmates. He spent 23 months there before being transferred to USP McNeil Island in Washington State on May 10, 1936. This transfer came 4 months before the end of his minimum sentence, which was scheduled for September 3, 1936, suggesting that his behavior at Alcatraz may have earned him some consideration for an earlier transfer. What makes Bolt's story particularly remarkable is what happened after his release from prison on September 3, 1936. Unlike many former Alcatraz inmates who struggled to reintegrate into society or return to criminal activity, Bolt built a stable and productive life. After his release, he returned to San Francisco and then moved to Honolulu, Hawaii, traveling on the SS President Hoover and arriving on September 14, 1936. He listed Hawaii as his permanent residence and quickly secured employment as a stevedore at Castle & Cook, a major employer involved in various industries, including pineapple and tuna. By 1942, Bolt was living at 627 Oahe in Honolulu, continuing his work as a stevedore until at least 1949. In 1951, records show him living in Maili, Hawaii. Most striking is the fact that Bolt never returned to prison, instead becoming a husband and father to 11 children. He worked steadily until his death on October 31, 1966, in Hawaii. Bolt's transformation from Alcatraz's first inmate to a family man and productive member of society represents a remarkable story of rehabilitation, one that counters the often bleak narratives associated with former Alcatraz prisoners. His case also serves as a reminder of how societal attitudes towards sexuality have evolved since the 1930s, with behavior that once led to federal imprisonment now recognized as a matter of personal identity and freedom. As we consider the youngest inmates who served time at Alcatraz, Frank Lucas Bolt's story stands out not only for his status as inmate number 1, but also for how his life after incarceration demonstrated the possibility of redemption and renewal, even after experiencing one of America's most notorious prisons. While Frank Lucas Bolt represented the beginning of Alcatraz's federal prison era as its first inmate in 1934, our next young prisoner, Robert Shibline, arrived much later during the prison's final decade, bringing with him a colorful criminal history that would connect him to one of the most famous escape attempts in American history. Robert Shibline, the sailor turned bank robber. Robert Shibline, often referred to as Banker Bob, presents an intriguing case among Alcatraz's younger inmates. Shibline was incarcerated at Alcatraz in 1958 at the relatively young age of 24, making him among the youngest prisoners during the later period of the penitentiary's operation. What makes Shibline's case particularly interesting is the controversy surrounding his exact age at the time of incarceration. While some sources, such as thetravel.com, specifically state he was 24 when sent to Alcatraz in 1958, other accounts, including a 2013 SF Gate article, mention he was 82 at that time, which would place his birth year around 1931 and make him about 27 at incarceration. This discrepancy highlights the challenges historians face when trying to establish precise details about Alcatraz inmates, as records are sometimes inconsistent or incomplete. Regardless of whether he was 24 or 27, Shibline was still notably young compared to many Alcatraz inmates who were often in their 30s or 40s. His path to the Rock began with a career in the United States Navy, a background that would later play a role in his criminal activities. Shibline's criminal journey started with bank robbery, a federal offense that frequently led to Alcatraz for those who were particularly troublesome or escape-prone. He was initially sent to Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary for his crimes before being transferred to Alcatraz after being implicated in a prisoner uprising. This pattern of being transferred to Alcatraz after causing problems at other facilities was typical for many inmates who ended up on the Rock. One of the most fascinating aspects of Shibline's criminal career was his unusual getaway method. Reports suggest he used a Navy aircraft carrier as a getaway vehicle for one of his bank robberies, a detail that sounds more like something from a Hollywood heist movie than real life. While the exact mechanics of how a bank robber managed to use a massive military vessel as an escape vehicle remain somewhat unclear, this colorful detail tale has become part of the Shibline legend. Once at Alcatraz, Shibline became involved in one of the most famous episodes in the prison's history, the 1962 escape attempt by Frank Morris and brothers John and Clarence Anglin. While not one of the escapees himself, Shibline reportedly assisted with the plot, suggesting that despite his youth, he had managed to establish enough trust and connections within the prison to be involved in such a high-risk venture. The 1962 escape, which remains unsolved to this day, with no conclusive evidence as to whether the three men drowned in San Francisco Bay or successfully reached freedom, would have occurred when Shibline was still in his late 20s or early 30s. His involvement, even in a peripheral role, connects him to one of the most enduring mysteries in American criminal history. Shibline remained at Alcatraz until its closure in 1963, experiencing the final chapter of the notorious prison's operation. Like most inmates, he was transferred to other federal facilities when Alcatraz shut down. What distinguishes Shibline from many other Alcatraz inmates is his post-prison life and his willingness to engage with the public about his experiences. In his later years, he became one of the former inmates who would return to Alcatraz, now a tourist attraction, to sign books and share stories with visitors. He also appeared in documentaries like Inside Alcatraz, Legends of the Rock, helping to preserve and share the history of the infamous penitentiary. Shibline was featured in a 2013 NPR piece about living memories from the last days of Alcatraz, highlighting his role as one of the surviving links to the prison's history. Through these public appearances and interviews, he helped provide first-hand accounts of life inside one of America's most notorious correctional facilities. While reports of his death have appeared online, with one Reddit post indicating he died at age 89, the exact date of his passing remains unclear from available sources. If he was indeed 24 in 1958, he would have been born around 1934, making him approximately 89 in 2023. Robert Shibline's story offers a fascinating glimpse into the experiences of a younger inmate during Alcatraz's final years and highlights how even decades after their release, former Alcatraz prisoners often remained defined by their time on the Rock, with many, like Shibline, eventually embracing their place in American criminal history rather than trying to escape it. As Robert Shibline's story illustrates the experiences of a young sailor-turned-bank robber who later became a public ambassador for Alcatraz history, we now turn to another young inmate who similarly transformed his prison experience into a lasting legacy, William "Bill" Baker, whose memoir would become one of the most widely read first-hand accounts of life on the Rock. William "Bill" Baker, the author of Alcatraz, or 1259. William G. "Bill" Baker stands out among the youngest inmates at Alcatraz, not only for his age, but also for how he transformed his experience into a lasting contribution to our understanding of life inside America's most notorious prison. Born in 1933 during the Great Depression, Baker was sent to Alcatraz in 1957 at the age of 23 or 24, depending on which source is consulted. Baker's journey to Alcatraz began with seemingly minor offenses compared to many of his fellow inmates. At age 18, he committed car theft in Oregon, setting in motion a series of events that would eventually lead him to the Rock. What escalated his case and ultimately resulted in his transfer to Alcatraz was not the severity of his original crime, but his multiple escape attempts from other prisons. This pattern of being sent to Alcatraz, not necessarily for the heinousness of one's original offense, but for being troublesome or escape-prone at other facilities, was common during the penitentiary's operation. Alcatraz served as the ultimate deterrent for inmates who couldn't be controlled elsewhere in the federal prison system. Upon arrival at Alcatraz, Baker was assigned the number AZ-1259, which would later become the title of his memoir. He spent approximately 3 to 4 years on the island, experiencing the harsh realities of a place where, as Warden Madigan described in his 1957 interview, privileges were extremely limited.
We don't have newspapers at this institution, Ed. We do have a 2-channel radio system. We don't have a commissary where they can supplement their diet in the dining room. We have 2 movies a month.
During his time at Alcatraz, Baker engaged in various activities to pass the time and make prison life more bearable. According to accounts from his later years, these included betting on ball games, joking with friends, and even smuggling and fermenting fruit to make alcoholic beverages, activities that, while prohibited, were part of the underground economy that existed even in the highly controlled environment of Alcatraz. Interestingly, Baker's criminal education continued at Alcatraz, where he learned to make counterfeit payroll checks checks, a skill that would later lead to his re-imprisonment after his release. This highlights one of the ironies of the prison system, that facilities designed to reform criminals could sometimes serve as educational institutions for new criminal enterprises. What truly sets Baker apart from many other former Alcatraz inmates is what he did with his experiences after his release. In the decades following his incarceration, he authored a memoir titled Alcatraz Noir dans 1259, providing readers with a first-hand account of life inside the infamous penitentiary from the perspective of a young inmate. According to a 2022 KTVU Fox 2 article, the book has sold over 200,000 copies, making it one of the most widely read accounts of life at Alcatraz. Unlike many former inmates who preferred to distance themselves from their time at Alcatraz, Baker embraced his connection to the prison in his later years. At age 89 in 2022, he was reported to reside in Toledo, Ohio, but would regularly visit Alcatraz 3 to 4 days a week to talk to visitors, sign autographs, and take pictures. Through these interactions, he became a living link to the history of Alcatraz, providing tourists with the rare opportunity to hear about the prison directly from someone who had experienced it firsthand. Baker's perspective on his time at Alcatraz is particularly interesting. According to the City Experiences blog, he stated that he doesn't harbor scars or nightmares from this period, viewing the island now as his turf. This surprisingly positive association with a place designed to be punitive suggests a complex psychological relationship with his incarceration experience. The story of William "Bill" Baker provides a fascinating contrast to the often tragic narratives associated with Alcatraz. While his early life was marked by crime and imprisonment, he managed to transform his experiences into something productive through his writing and public engagement. His willingness to return regularly to the site of his incarceration and share his stories with visitors has helped preserve an important piece of American criminal justice history through first-hand testimony. As one of the youngest inmates at Alcatraz, Baker's perspective offers valuable insights into how a young person navigated and ultimately survived one of America's most notorious penal environments, emerging not just alive, but eventually finding a way to convert that experience into a form of personal redemption and historical contribution. While William "Bill" Baker used his Alcatraz experience to become an author and historical witness in his later years, our final young inmate entered the infamous prison during its twilight era, becoming part of the last chapter in Alcatraz's operational history, Russell Wayne Carpenter, whose story bridges the gap between the prison's notorious past and its eventual closure. Russell Wayne Carpenter, one of the last. Our final subject in this examination of Alcatraz's youngest inmates is Russell Wayne Carpenter, a complex figure whose story intersects with the final years of the infamous prison's operation. Born on February 22, 1936, Carpenter was sent to Alcatraz in 1960 at the age of 24 for a series of serious crimes that included murder, carjacking, kidnapping, automobile theft, and manslaughter. Carpenter's early life was marked by factors that would ultimately contribute to his criminal behavior. He was described as a brawler who dropped out of high school, and his father was reportedly a notorious safecracker who spent much of his life in prison. This family history of criminality and his early exit from education created a foundation for the troubles that would follow. Unlike some of the other young inmates we've discussed, Carpenter arrived at Alcatraz during its final years, serving there from 1960 until the prison's closure in 1963. This timing placed him among the last group of prisoners to experience the notorious facility, witnessing the end of an era in American corrections. His presence at Alcatraz is confirmed by inmate rosters, with records from AlcatrazHistory.com listing him as inmate number 1538. This documentation aligns with records from the National Archives, firmly establishing his place in the final chapter of the prison's operation. Carpenter's experience at Alcatraz occurred during a period when the prison's future was increasingly in question. By the early 1960s, the facility's high maintenance costs and the changing philosophy of corrections were leading to discussions about its closure. The young inmate would have witnessed these final days, perhaps sensing the impending end of the institution. After Alcatraz closed its doors in 1963, Carpenter, like all remaining inmates, was transferred to other federal penitentiaries, including facilities in Georgia and Illinois. Surprisingly, he was granted parole on his first attempt after serving more than 15 years, with Doris Mattingly, a woman involved in the incident, leading to his imprisonment, serving as a witness. Their subsequent marriage ended in divorce due to opposition from her parents, adding a layer of personal complexity to his post-incarceration life. Carpenter's life after Alcatraz took several unexpected turns. According to reports in The New Yorker, he trained as a welder, became involved in a shootout, and was questioned about potential connections to Whitey Bulger, the notorious Boston mobster who had also spent time at Alcatraz. These incidents suggest that despite his release, Carpenter struggled to fully distance himself from criminal associations and activities. In his later years, Carpenter moved to Northern California and became involved in drug trafficking before developing dementia. He passed away on December 12, 2021, in a memory care facility, as confirmed by his obituary, bringing to a close a life that had intersected with one of America's most infamous correctional institutions. What makes Carpenter's story particularly significant is his status as a witness to the end of the Alcatraz era. As one of the youngest inmates during the prison's final years, he experienced the conclusion of an infamous chapter in American criminal justice history. His perspective, as someone who entered Alcatraz as a young man and lived to see its transformation from active prison to tourist attraction, provides a unique historical lens. Carpenter's life after Alcatraz, with its mixture of attempts at legitimate work and returns to criminal activity, reflects the challenges that many former inmates faced upon release. The stigma of having been imprisoned at Alcatraz, combined with limited opportunities and established patterns of behavior, created significant obstacles to successful reintegration into society. As we consider Carpenter's story alongside the other young inmates of Alcatraz, we see how youthful crimes could lead to decades of consequences, not just in terms of incarceration, but in the long shadow cast over one's entire life trajectory. The story of Russell Wayne Carpenter reminds us that Alcatraz wasn't just a place where notorious criminals from a bygone era were held. It continued to receive young offenders right up until its final days, forever altering their life paths. For more content like this, click on the videos showing on your screen now.